Welcome, friends, to another episode of Down Home with me, the Ramblin' Southern Gentleman. I've got a great show lined up for you today that'll tickle those ears and spark curiosity and thought. Our main stories for this episode are Coosa River Monsters, Giants in Alabama, and John Pratt, the inventor of the typewriter. Well, sort of. I've also got a surprising story that may just change your way of thinking on what the oldest inhabited city in the United States is. And no, it's not St. Augustine, Florida. So pour yourself a big old glass of ice-cold sweet tea, kick your shoes off, and set a spell. Let's escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life for just a bit and do some exploring of the past and take a stroll down memory lane as well. Today's featured food is fried potatoes. When I think of good old-fashioned home-cooked meals, it usually involves fried potatoes along with many other things. But fried potatoes is definitely always a staple. Potatoes cut to about dime-sized cubes, fried in a little bit of oil with some onions. You just can't beat it. The smell will permeate the whole house and linger. A smell that, to me, is far from offensive. It reminds me of a nice cozy evening at home with the windows open to let a cool breeze through the house. Something on the TV in the background, maybe an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, or even Rescue 911, seeing as this memory is based in the early 1990s. And through the open window you can hear an old owl in a tree just down from the house, hooting to let you know his presence. There's a chorus of toads and peepers down by the pond out in the pasture that are singing their song of the night that provides a rich background to the evening. And if you look out the window, you can see the faint greenish yellow pop of lightning bugs as they glide slowly through the backyard. Yes, everything seems safe and happy, with Dad watching Unsolved Mysteries after a day of hard work, and with Mama in the kitchen cleaning up from supper. It was a slower time, a happier time. It's funny how smells trigger such deep and rich memories. Anyway, back to the fried taters. It never fails, as hard as I try to cook in moderation since it's just me I'm cooking for, I never can master the art of that moderation. Anytime I cook fried potatoes, or anything for that matter, I always cook enough for Cox's army, especially spaghetti. But that's okay, because as everyone knows, spaghetti is twice as good the following day. Or in my case, the following whole week. But that brings me to the topic of Cox's army. Growing up, I've heard that term all my life. You've got enough so-and-so to feed Cox's army. But one question has always bugged me for years. Who was Cox? And why did he have an army? And why were there so many of them? Well, I set out to do a little investigative work for this episode to answer that very question, and this is what I learned. In the spring of 1894, as the nation staggered under the worst economic depression it had ever known up until that point, a man named Jacob Coxey decided that quiet suffering wasn't enough anymore. Coxey was an Ohio businessman, and like millions of Americans, he watched jobs disappear after the Panic of 1893. Factories shut down, railroads collapsed, and hungry men wandered the country looking for work that no longer existed. Coxey believed the federal government had both the responsibility and the power to help. So he organized something radical for its time, a March on Washington. Officially called the Army of the Commonwealth in Christ, history remembers it by a simpler name, Coxey's Army. Starting on March the 25th, 1894, about 100 unemployed men set out from Massillon, Ohio, walking towards the nation's capital in what Coxey called a petition in boots. Their demand was straightforward: government-funded public works. Coxey wanted roads built and infrastructure improved, with workers paid in paper currency to put back into circulation. It sounded extreme then, but it would sound familiar later. As the march moved east through Pennsylvania and beyond, other groups joined in from across the country. By the time Coxey's army reached the outskirts of Washington, D.C. on April the 30th, hundreds had arrived and thousands more gathered in nearby camps. The response from the government was swift and dismissive. When Coxey attempted to speak at the Capitol, he was arrested for stepping on the grass. The protest quickly lost momentum and faded from the headlines. But Coxey's army left a lasting mark. It was the first major protest march on Washington, setting a precedent for generations to come. And decades later, the ideas Coxey pushed, federal job programs and public works, well, that would become a reality with the New Deal. So there you go, folks. There we have the origin of the old saying, enough to feed Cox's army. It seems that over time, and as the saying was passed on, it lost the EY at the end of Coxey's name and became Cox's army instead. The featured Southern word or phrase for today was submitted by a listener, and I couldn't have found a better one myself. That phrase is grinning like a possum eating persimmons. Now, if you know what a persimmon is, then you know why that possum has a gritty grin while eating it. Those things are bitter. I've used this phrase myself several times, and I've heard it all my life. So the next time you see someone grinning from ear to ear, usually in a mischievous manner, you can say they were grinning like a possum eating a persimmon. I also had another quote that was submitted by a listener. Now this was by a man who was not Southern, but it's one that resonated with me deeply. It's something that I feel deep in my bones. And that quote is, "If you can make someone laugh, you give them a little vacation." That quote is attributed to Sir Winston Churchill. Now, for those of you who don't know, Sir Winston Churchill was the British Prime Minister who led the United Kingdom through most of World War II and then served the United Kingdom again after the war. A truly fascinating man, worthy of your time to research him a little bit. I've always tried to lend people a smile when they don't have one themselves. Not just a smile, but a little humor that not only entertains, but provokes thought and a little bit of introspective. So, how's your week been? It's been bitterly cold here. The threat of a winter ice storm kept us on our toes around here, but thankfully, it shifted north and spared the area. You know, something that stuck in my head this week, something that I've noticed here lately, is just how many people are going through life totally oblivious. People not reading signs when all of their questions would have been answered by just being observant to the signs around them. People who are oblivious to the things they do that just doesn't make sense. Just being oblivious in general. Take, for example, if you will, people posting selfies of themselves supposedly asleep in bed. Excuse me. Who are we supposed to believe took that of you? Your dog? A roach? A bed bug, maybe? Totally oblivious to the fact that the scenario just doesn't add up. Another time when I witnessed people cruising down the highway of life in total oblivion is when the supper club took the meeting on the road to go visit Buc-ee's for my birthday last year. We had made our visit and was on the interstate headed back home. Up ahead we noticed a blue glow over the horizon. Now it was pitch black outside with a storm behind us. As we got closer to the glow ahead, it was apparent that it was coming from a tiny compact SUV just ahead of us. As we approached the SUV, the glow was enveloping the whole atmosphere around that SUV. As we came up beside the vehicle, I could get a good view as I was in the passenger seat. A man and a woman were in a brand new SUV, and their navigation screen, which spanned nearly the entire width of their dash, was glowing so bright it seemed to be giving them an X-ray right there as they cruised down the road. It was like the scene from Home Alone where the crook was electrocuted and his skeleton was visible during the whole event. We hurriedly passed the SUV and left it in our dust so as to outrun the glow so we ourselves could see the road ahead. And a few minutes later, as we took the off-ramp and came to the end of the off-ramp down below the elevated interstate, the blue glow of that SUV passed above us. Now, we couldn't see the SUV, but we knew exactly who and what it was. That poor couple, I guess they were oblivious to the fact that the intensity of that navigation screen could be adjusted. I bet to this day they sit around talking about what a bad purchase that was, since they can't even see to drive their new vehicle in the dark. Speaking of that same trip, I think one member of the supper club was oblivious to the fact that they had used my Bucky's fudge as their footrest for the 50-mile trip back home. Finally, and I'll get off this subject, there was a time I was oblivious to the fact that yellow jackets can in fact escape the housing of a push mower. I guess I was about 10 years old. At that point, mowing the yard had become my chore during the summer when school was out. We had a riding lawnmower, as our front yard alone was a few acres. However, as punishment for something I had done or said, of which I can't even remember now what it was, I was told I had to push mow the yard using a push mower that was kept as backup to the riding lawnmower. Now, of course, Daddy wouldn't have made me push mow the entire front yard. He would have made me mow enough of it to let me get a good taste of hard work, and rightfully so, before telling me I could use the riding lawnmower again. Anyways, being a kid, I was fuming over having to use the push mower, which honestly was unusual for me. Fuming, that is. I was talking to myself and thinking of how I could already be done with the yard if I was using the riding lawnmower and back to playing in the woods or wading around in the kiddie pool out back. In my haze of shoulda, coulda, woulda land in my head, I looked ahead and saw yellow jackets flying in and out of a hole in the ground several feet in front of me. Now, I had not noticed this before until this point. I remember the thought I had so well. If I'm having a bad day, they are going to have one too. So I pushed ahead, and when I came up on the hole in the ground, I pushed that mower right over the top of it and stopped and held it there. I look back on it now and realize that it was one of the worst mistakes of my life. Within seconds, a cloud of angry yellow jackets, or as I like to refer to them as, souped-up combat-minded wasp, enveloped me. Immediate pain and shock flowed over my entire body. I released the safety bar on that push mower and took off running like I was trying to outrun Armageddon itself. I came to the corner of the house, made the turn, and ran in the backyard where that kiddie pool lay like a welcoming oasis. I hopped into that pool and laid down under the water. However, not all of my backside made it under the water, since there was more of me than there was of water. I held my breath and kept my head under the water because those stings to the ears were worse than the stings I was receiving to my rear end that was sticking out of the water. After I could hold my breath no longer, and it seemed as though those stings to the rear had ceased, I rose up out of that water and made tracks to the house. I ended up not having to finish the yard that day. However, it was there the next day, and I finished mowing it on the riding lawnmower. Daddy took care of the yellow jacket's nest, and I learned a valuable lesson that day. Thoughts such as that ran through my head just before that awful event, and fuming would never get me anywhere in life. Thankfully, I don't have a temper, and I don't get angry, nor am I vengeful. Maybe it stems from that awful incident, or maybe it's just my nature. I'm not sure. No, friends, it just doesn't pay to be oblivious. It pays great dividends to be very observant. Since I am an observant person, I witnessed something the other day on my way to Walmart that really made my week. I caught the spectacle of a one-man band in the parking lot of an abandoned chicken joint on my way to Walmart. That poor guy looked like death eating a cracker, but he was giving it all he had while attempting to play every instrument he had attached to himself. And you know, when I see spectacles like that, it leaves me wondering whether to bless it or blame it, kiss it or cuss it. So always pay attention to your surroundings. You might just see something as funny as that one-man band, or pick up a nice little funny story to pass on. Well, folks, it's time for a short break. When we come back, we'll tackle our main stories for this episode, which are the Coosa River Monster, giants in Etowah County, and the Alabama ties to the invention of the typewriter. So stay tuned. I'll be right back. Welcome back. let's dive into our main stories for this episode. So, what do all three of our topics for today have in common? They all share ties with Etowah County, Alabama, more specifically, Gadsden, Alabama. So, the Coosa River Monster. Now, there's a picturesque river that flows through Etowah County, Alabama, named the Coosa. Since the first travelers came through the area, and even before that by the Native Americans, there have been stories about the creatures that can be found in the waters of the Coosa, or, as some may say, can't be found when searched for. It seems that there has been reports of a creature, or monster, by many people who didn't go looking for such a creature. The first documented sighting was published in the Gadsden Times on June the 8th, 1877. A man named Marcus Foster was fishing on the Coosa near Ballplay Creek. He saw a disturbance in the water in the distance around the corner, and when he caught up with the disturbance, he was shocked to see a creature looking back at him. After staring at each other for a few seconds, the creature took its leave by slipping under the water and swimming away. Judge Lemuel Standifer, sorry, I butchered that completely. Let me start over. Judge Lemuel Standifer reported seeing it in Rome, Georgia, and the famed riverboat captain, James E. Elliott, who was a key person in the growth of Gadsden, reported seeing a massive creature that was unknown to him. Each report described the creature as a large serpentine creature with scales, 15 to 20 foot long and covered in fins. A group that was rafting about 2 miles below Gadsden reported an encounter with a creature of which traumatized the entire group. Each sighting was reportedly very brief and just a couple of minutes at the longest before the creature would slip under the surface of the water. In the year 1882, a newspaper reporter saw a disturbance in the water and went to get a closer look. Upon his closer inspection, he concluded that it was a tangled mess of leaves, weeds, and vines from the bottom of the river that had been dislodged and sent to the top of the water by trapped gases underneath at the river bottom. After his published account, the reports of sightings dropped off. Then, a few years later, the creature would reemerge when a group of picnickers around the 10-mile island near Ohatchee reported that they had encountered the creature at the riverbank and had successfully stoned the creature to death. Monster catfish have been reported being spotted in the river as far back as the riverboat days, when the captains would report such sightings. Then, when the first bridges were built across the river in Gadsden, the workers reported catfish at the bottom of the river that were as big as Volkswagen bugs. Now, I will have to say, since Volkswagen bugs were not a thing during the 30s when the Broad Street Bridge was built, I'm assuming they meant when the later bridges were built, since they use that as a size reference. Just as a note, the state record for a catfish that has been caught from the state's waters is 111 pounds. Other shocking sightings in the waters of the Coosa from the area include sightings of the alligator garfish. This fish is a prehistoric-looking fish with sharp teeth and can be several feet long. A group of fishermen fishing in a boat near Riverview Hospital reported spotting an alligator-looking creature that promptly disappeared under the water, of which they didn't report for a long time due to being afraid of being ridiculed. So, my question for you, the listener, is, have you ever spotted something unusual in the waters of the Coosa? Have you been swimming and something touched your feet, or maybe an unusual, unfamiliar fin type thing break the water in the distance? Have you encountered catfish as big as bugs? Let me know. I'd love to hear your story. You can email me at contactdownhomeshow@gmail.com, or if you're listening on YouTube or another outlet that I've posted this podcast through, leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. So let's move on to the next story. Giants in Etowah County, Alabama. For many years, I've read stories about giant skeletons being found all over the world. It's always fascinated me. I've seen old black and white photos of these skeletons being unearthed and displayed. I've been hard-pressed to find actual published scholarly articles about them, but I believe that they are real occurrences. The Bible includes mentions of giants. In April of 1886, much of North Alabama was plagued with flooding. The first week in April that year, there were anywhere from 8 to 12 inches of rainfall for the area. The Coosa River, according to reports, rose 6 feet over the previously recorded flood record. It was said that the river grew to a mile wide where Gadsden was located. Gadsden sits much higher than normal river level, so the downtown area was spared. However, the lower lying part suffered from the flooding. It was said that the floodwaters covered land up to around 4th Street and Town Creek, where a riverboat had broke its moorings and floated to that area. When the floodwaters receded, many articles of past civilizations had been unearthed and picked up by the residents of Gadsden. Some of the more noteworthy artifacts were located a few miles from Gadsden on the river in Horton's Bend. More specifically, Green Foster's place, as well as Colonel Sam Henry's place. His farm was composed of about 250 acres of river bottom land. After the flood waters receded, his son was out inspecting the property, where he found that only about 40 or 50 acres of that river bottom land survived and could be farmed again. The rest had been swept away by the flooding. That wasn't the only thing that he discovered while surveying the property. Upon closer inspection, he found that the floodwaters had uncovered some very interesting burial grounds. He found that at the head of every grave there was an earthenware type pot that contained items such as arrowheads, tomahawks, knives, pipes, and other items of lives lived long ago. And the most curious find in these graves were the bones themselves. When one of the skulls was freed from the mud, it was found to be large enough where Colonel Henry could place his own head into the skull from the bottom. After unearthing the other bones, they were laid out to form the skeletons. The bone of the skull was almost a half an inch thick. The thigh bone was about 22 inches in length, and the bone from shoulder to elbow measured 20 inches. When the skeleton was laid out, it was found that the skeleton was close to 12 feet tall from head to the bottom of its feet. 2 or 3 of these massive giant skeletons were found on the property after the flood. They were definitely from a prehistoric race. The skulls were solid bone, flat on top, and did not have a seam that is found on modern humans. This discovery was documented in many publications at the time. One skeleton was kept by Colonel Henry and displayed. The others were sent off, but have been lost to time, as well as the skeleton that Colonel Henry kept for himself. The artifacts that had been uncovered with the skeletons have also been lost to time or have made their ways into private collections not to be seen by the public since. I suspect many of the holders of these items are reluctant to tell of their existence for fear of being stolen, or being required to hand them over to authorities, or to be ridiculed by those who know better. So, do you have any knowledge of giant prehistoric skeletons in Alabama? If you do, shoot me a message or leave a comment. I'd love to hear your story. So, moving on. Let's talk about the typewriter and whether or not it's an Alabama invention. I feel like you must be of a certain age to be familiar or have used a typewriter. Back before the computer, the typewriter was a very familiar and plentiful office machine. Funny enough, to this day, I still encounter a typewriter from time to time. Actually, I used one just this last week at work. Although we only have one left in the office, it still sees some use on a weekly basis. As a side note, I really love the sound of someone proficiently typing on a typewriter. For some reason, it's oddly relaxing. Have you ever heard of Mr. John Pratt? No? Well, I hadn't either. Mr. Pratt was an attorney in Center, Alabama, and investor in the newspaper The National Democrat. He also later served as the editor of the Gadsden Times. He apparently wrote quite a lot and was tired of the toll that handwriting was taking on his hands. He set out to develop a writing machine. His endeavors would be crushed by the Civil War, though. Because of the Civil War, he was unable to secure financing for his typewriter, and being frustrated, he moved to England, where he was able to gain a patent there for his writing machine in 1867. A type plate with letters was moved vertically and horizontally by the use of keys, and a hammer behind the plate would hammer the letter onto the paper. His invention was even written about in Scientific American. Mr. Pratt's type machine was not the first typewriting machine that had been invented, though. There had been previous inventions which allowed people to type onto paper, more specifically, a machine that was invented in England in 1808, which was to aid a blind person to write. From 1829 to 1870, there were several patents granted to people for typing machines, but there were no actual typewriters that made it to the commercial market. A man from Pennsylvania by the name of Christopher Latham Sholes developed a page number machine and was granted a patent for the invention in 1864. A friend and fellow inventor, Carolus Glidden, told Pratt he should consider incorporating letters into his machine and told him about Pratt's type machine. In 1870, the first commercially produced typewriter hit the market. In 1873, Remington brought its typewriter, the Sholes and Glidden, to market and introduced the QWERTY keyboard. I believe Mr. Pratt of Cherokee, Alabama, should be credited as the grandfather of the modern typewriter. While his fame wasn't widespread out of Cherokee and Etowah counties, he was quite well known in England. Now, I've got a little bonus story for you. It's called The Night Charles Ponzi Became a Hero in Alabama. And I promised on the last episode that I'd tell you about this story on this episode. So, let's get into it. You know, every now and then, history likes to play a little trick on us. It takes somebody we think we understand real well, somebody we've filed away in our minds as a villain, and then, just for one strange night, it turns him into something else entirely. Tonight's story is about a man whose very name became a warning. A man whose name we still use today when we talk about greed and deception. Charles Ponzi. Yes, sir, that Ponzi. And believe it or not, for one smoky night in Alabama, Charles Ponzi was not a crook. He was a hero. Now, to understand how in the world Charles Ponzi ended up in Alabama in the first place, you've got to remember what his life looked like after the Great Collapse. By the fall of 1920, Ponzi had become the most famous swindler in America. He promised investors impossible returns. He took in millions. And then the whole beautiful lie came crashing down. He was arrested, convicted, and sent to prison in Massachusetts. When he got out in 1923, the money was gone. His fame had turned poisonous, and in Boston, his name was mud. Nobody would touch him. Banks wouldn't deal with him. Business partners disappeared. Doors closed the moment he walked up the steps. So Ponzi did what a lot of broken men have done in this country. He went south. He drifted through the southern states looking for work, looking for a fresh start, looking for some place where folks didn't recognize his face or his name. By the winter, he found himself in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, Birmingham in the early 1920s was a booming industrial town. Steel mills, railroads, boarding houses full of workers and travelers passing through. Ponzi wasn't rich anymore. He wasn't famous here. He just was another man staying in a modest boarding house trying to figure out what came next. And that's where fate came a-knocking. One cold night in 1923, a fire broke out in the building where Ponzi was staying, a small hotel or boarding house, depending on which newspaper you read. Flames tore through the lower floors. Smoke filled the hallways, and upstairs, several women were trapped. The stairways were choked with smoke. People were screaming from the windows. Fire engines hadn't even fully arrived yet. And that's when Charles Ponzi did something nobody expected. Instead of running out into the street, he ran back inside. According to the Birmingham newspapers the next morning, Ponzi rushed into the burning building again and again. He helped guide frightened women down the stairways. He led some through windows and ladders. At one point, they said the smoke was so thick he had to crawl on his hands and knees to find them. Time after time, he went back in. Not for money, not for attention, just to get people out alive. By the time the fire was under control, several lives had been saved, and the newspapers called Charles Ponzi a hero. They wrote about his courage, his calm under pressure. They praised a brave boarder who had risked his life for strangers. And here's the strangest part of all. Almost nobody in Birmingham knew who he really was. Down here, his name didn't yet carry the weight it did up north. Most folks had never heard of the Boston postal coupon scandal. They didn't know his face from the newspapers. To them, he wasn't the greatest con man in America. He was just the man who ran into a burning building. For a brief, shining moment in Alabama, Charles Ponzi had something he hadn't had in years, an honest reputation. But history, friends, history has a long memory. Ponzi didn't stay in Birmingham. Within a year or two, he drifted farther south into Florida, and before long, the old habits came calling again. He got involved in shady real estate schemes, sold land he didn't really own, promised profits that didn't exist. In 1926, the law caught up with him again. More prison, more disgrace, and finally, deportation back to Italy, and later exile in Brazil, where he died poor and forgotten. But every once in a while, historians stumble across that old Birmingham newspaper clipping about the night of the fire, about the brave rescuer, and it leaves us with a mighty curious thought that even the most famous villain in financial history for one night in Alabama did something truly good, did something honest, did something heroic. And I reckon that's a reminder worth keeping, that people are rarely just one thing, not saints, not sinners, and sometimes even a man named Ponzi can run into the flames and come back out with someone else's life in his arms. Well, friends, it's that time again. It's time for a short break. Stay tuned, and when we come back, there'll be plenty more to tickle those ears. Welcome back. Thanks for sticking with me this far. I hope you're enjoying the show, and I hope you've learned a little something from those main stories. Now, remember to hit that like button if you're listening on YouTube or another outlet, and if you're listening to me on Rewind Radio, thanks for the support. While I was doing my research for this episode, I ran across some interesting information that challenges St. Augustine, Florida's claim of being the oldest city in the United States. It seems that title should go to a city right here in Alabama. So let's talk about it a little bit. So in the 4th grade, my class, along with the 5th grade class, went on a trip to Camp Cosby on Lake Martin. One of our camp guides was from St. Augustine, Florida. She told us with great pride that her hometown was the oldest city in the United States. She was quite high and mighty about it too. That stuck with me as a child because I was always fascinated by history. In my 4th grade brain, I couldn't figure out how St. Augustine, Florida would have been the oldest city, since clearly it would have to have been one on the East Coast. You know, there where the first settlers from England settled. Of course, that's what my 4th grade mind, with limited knowledge of history at that point, thought. I would later learn how St. Augustine came about holding that distinction. So, if you haven't picked up by now, St. Augustine claims to be the oldest continuously inhabited city in the United States. Well, they may just be completely wrong about that, and the city that is truly the oldest continually inhabited city is right here in Alabama, and that city is Childersburg. Hernando de Soto's travels through the southeastern U.S. brought him through present-day Childersburg, near De Soto Caverns, which at the time was the capital of the Coosa Indians. This took place in 1540, and after spending a few weeks in the area, some of the people in DeSoto's party remained behind in town, which established European settlement in the area when DeSoto's party departed the area. So, in fact, Childersburg has roots of European settlement dating back to the year 1540. St. Augustine was founded in 1565 by the Spanish Admiral Pedro Menendez de Aviles, which means Childersburg predates St. Augustine by 25 years. 1540 also starts the recorded history of what now is the state of Alabama. Now, folks, I'm not sure if this is just often overlooked by historians or if the Chamber of Commerce in St. Augustine just refuses to acknowledge this. Maybe no one has brought it to the attention of St. Augustine. Maybe there's a technicality I've missed that keeps St. Augustine on their throne as the oldest city in the U.S. I just don't know. But the next time you're in St. Augustine and a tour guide mentions that they hold that title, tell them to do a little research on Childersburg, Alabama. And if you found that piece of history interesting, keep on the lookout on my YouTube channel, The Ramblin' Southern Gentleman, because I fully intend to do a standalone recording on the subject where I do an extended deeper dive on this topic. In addition to that last little tidbit, while researching stories and odd news clips for this episode, I came across an interesting news story from 1981 out of Dallas, Texas. After I read the old article, I dug a little deeper, and it seems like it was quite the scandal. I'm going to read you the article, and now this is just one article in a big series of articles covering this story, but I'm going to have to change up a few words so as not to get a community guideline strike against me from the outlets I released this show through. The article was sourced from UPI's Internet Archives. Virginia Beach, Virginia, July the 15th, 1981. A Dallas man told police he mistook his mother-in-law for a large raccoon when he unalived her with a hatchet in her garage in April, according to testimony at his preliminary hearing Wednesday. Detective Lewis Chappell said Orville Wyatt Lloyd, 33, of Dallas, Texas, told police following the unaliving of Margaret K. Wise, 49, that he awoke about 5:30 a.m. and went to search for a raccoon he believed had wandered into the garage overnight. After being unable to find the animal, Lloyd allegedly told Chappell he went back to bed and returned to the garage later in the morning with Miss Wise, his wife's mother. Chappell testified Lloyd said in his statement to police that he picked up the hatchet and hit Miss Wise once before realizing who she was. Lloyd told police, however, that even after he recognized her, he hit her again. I snapped or something, Lloyd told police in his statement. An autopsy revealed Miss Wise had been hit 17 times. Lloyd allegedly told police that he had been arguing with his mother-in-law with whom he was visiting for the entire week before the unaliving occurred. Lloyd was bound over to circuit court on unaliving charges. Now, folks, I don't claim to be a smart man, but I do like to think I have what they call walking around sense. I haven't met a raccoon yet that I have mistaken for a person, and I've met a few. Also, though I have many questions about this article and incident, one of the ones at the forefront of my mind is, what was his mother-in-law doing in that garage that he could have mistaken her as a large raccoon? Was she perched on a ceiling rafter like a raccoon might do? Was she crouched down in a trash can as a scavenging raccoon might be found? Another question that comes to mind is, the article says he hit her once before he realized it was a person. More specifically, his mother-in-law, and when he realized it was her, he hit her again. What on earth did this poor woman do to deserve that? Anyways, I guess my mind will never be eased or questions answered related to this case. Unless I break down and do a whole podcast on this case. Let me know if you would like to hear that. Now back to the subject of raccoons, though. Living in the rural South, raccoons are just a part of life. It's not uncommon to see them here, yonder, and there. Sadly, most of the time I see them on the side of the road, victims of a hit and run by a Buick or a Toyota. This story takes me back to a memory. The year was, well, I don't even know what year it was, but I was a senior in college. The place I lived at in college was an old house that had been divided up into 5 units. The basement unit stayed vacant during most of my tenure there, but the other units were rented. I didn't really know my neighbors in the house other than one that lived in the unit on the opposite side of the house. I had some of my business classes with him, and we had become friends, even though our majors were different. Now, I was working the night shift one stormy night, about 25 minutes from the house. As the storm rolled in, I prepared the reports and made preparations for the storm at work in case we were to lose power. Well, as the thunder rolled and the lightning struck, I was in the zone getting my work completed as much as I could when my cell phone started ringing. Now that caught me off guard a little bit, as it was about midnight at that point and no one ever called me that late. I looked at my phone and it was my neighbor from the unit on the other side of the old house. I answered and all he said was, "Dude," and I replied, "Yes." About that time I heard the thunder crack on his end, and he yelled right into the phone, "Something's in here." I could tell he was panicked and something bad was a-going down. After a few seconds, and after he calmed down a little bit, he told me that the power was off and that there was a huge crash in his living room. He said he jumped up to see what it was, and when he turned the corner, he knew he was not alone. He said he tried to find his cell phone to use the flashlight on the phone to see what was in his apartment. When he found his phone, the light wouldn't work and he was still in total darkness. I asked him what he thought it was, and he didn't know. He wanted to know if I would come over and help him out in the situation, and I told him that I wasn't at home, but I was at work. He said he was standing in the doorway of his room, looking out into the dark living room. "I hear something making a weird noise, and I think it's crawling up my curtains," he said. After a few moments, he said, "There's 2 dim eyes looking at me from the top of that curtain rod." A few more moments passed, and apparently the 2 of them, him and this being, just had a staring contest in the dark. It seems like the thing was going to stay up there on that curtain rod, staring down at him until Gabriel blew his horn. I asked him what's happening. He said, "I don't know, it's just sitting up there looking at me. All I see is a faint glow of eyes." Just as he got those words out of his mouth, boom! Lightning struck just outside and lit the room up through the windows. He screamed, "It's a raccoon!" Apparently, the raccoon screamed as well, and all bets were off. Total pandemonium broke out. That raccoon took a flying leap off that curtain rod, and for a few seconds, both him and that raccoon were making laps around that living room. They were both tip-tapping the tarantella around that place with their feet only touching the floor every 4th step. Now keep in mind, I was still on the other end of the phone. I could hear bits and pieces of what was going on. There was a lot of choice words being used on the other end. I could hear the chirps and shrieks of that raccoon. I didn't know if they had engaged in hand-to-hand combat or what was going on. All I could do is hang on the other end of the call and root him on in his fight for his life. After a few seconds, he came back on the line, out of breath and voice shaking. "It's gone," he said. "I opened the door and it shot out of here like it was shot out of a cannon." Well, I had to get back to work, so after convincing him he was fine, I hung up and I went on with my nightly work. When morning broke, I was relieved by the day shift at work and I made my way home. When I pulled into the yard in front of my unit, I noticed my old friend sitting outside of his unit on the other side of the house. He was sitting in a broken lawn chair smoking a cigarette, looking pretty haggard. When I got out of my car, I walked over to hear more about the tangled tango with his midnight visitor. As soon as I got over to his little porch, he said, "Man, you're not going to believe this, but last night when I got bedded down after that mess, I was laying there listening to the thunder and another raccoon pushed my bedroom door open and barged in my room. I was almost asleep, too. I jumped up and out of my skin and out of that bed and had to fight it out of this place with a broom," he said. Thankfully, the power had been restored at that point, and he was able to cut on a light to see the every move of this critter. He invited me into his unit to survey the aftermath of the brouhaha. There were tufts of insulation from the attic strewn all through the apartment. The curtains had been pulled down from the rods. The access hatch to the attic in the living room had fallen through. Apparently, the raccoons had taken refuge from the storm in the attic of the old house, and the thunder had stirred the two up and they had fallen through the hatch. Now, he was my friend, but he was so lazy he wouldn't have worked in a pie factory, as the old saying goes. So the fact that he had to go around with this raccoon, or raccoons, kind of tickled me. He was also the type of person who would sit in court and have said something dumb like, "Judge, I'm not going to sit here and argue with you." So I think, to say the least, this experience may have knocked him down a few notches from acting all high and mighty. I know it provided us with some good laughs afterwards. Now, it wasn't long before my friend gave up his lease on his unit and moved down the road to a nice apartment complex where there wasn't a chance of raccoons using an attic access point to drop in on him for a visit. The girl who moved in his old unit the following week after his exit had a critter problem as well, though her problem wasn't with raccoons. It was with random cats finding their way into her unit. To the day I moved out, I don't think they ever found out how the cats were getting in, and I never heard any more about it after I moved away. Thankfully, I never had such problems in my unit. Now, I did, however, have a run-in with a raccoon of my own a few years later. My back porch is technically a sunroom, for lack of a better description. It's closed in with ceiling to knee-height windows and a door leading to the outside. While I don't utilize it for a sitting area, it does get plenty of use, mostly as a transition or mudroom between the great outdoors and my inside sanctuary, as well as a bit of a catch-all, for when things are transitioning into the house or on their way out, or, just don't have their own place inside just yet. Well, one morning, I was making my way to the backyard and opened the door to the back porch to don my trusty work-around-the-house flip-flops. I walked out and noticed I had left the outside door open to the back porch overnight. Not a big deal, because there's a storm door that was closed. Plus, there's an exterior door from the kitchen that leads out onto the back porch. Or so I thought. It wasn't a big deal. As I walked out onto the porch and I was looking over the open door situation, something moved behind me, startling me. I jumped and I turned to see what was moving behind me, and as I did, a big old raccoon fell off the stand-up deep freeze. As it hit the floor, it jumped up and stood on its hind legs. I screamed. It screamed. I don't know who was more scared, me or him. Now, after I screamed, I started talking in languages I didn't even know, but he must have understood them. He took off past me, boogity, 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 and in one swift move, made it through that storm door, which I thought was latched. It either wasn't, or he opened it with ninja stealth, because out he shot like Moody's goose in a hailstorm. I learned my lesson that day on critter-proofing that back porch. When I look back on my life, what little I've experienced of it so far, I often wonder how these weird happenings always find their way to my doorstep. Fate always seems to blow a Category 5 circus my way. For those of you who might be city dwellers or may not have experience with wildlife, let me give you a word of warning. Raccoons may be cute and cuddly looking, but be ye not deceived. They are wild animals. They will tear you apart, they can be destructive, and most of all, they can carry rabies. Stay clear of them and don't approach them. They are not your friends, no matter how sad and cute their faces might be. Well, friends, we've come to that time again. Time to close out another episode. If you've enjoyed this one, please hit that like button, and if you're not already subscribed, please do so you don't miss future episodes, as well as my other content. If you're listening on the radio, please be sure to look up my channel on YouTube, The Ramblin' Southern Gentleman. Join me next time when I'll have another episode chock full of interesting stories, and hopefully a few funny ones as well, as we celebrate, preserve, and learn more about life in the South. One of the main stories for the next episode will be about the Grand Ole Opry, We may even talk about the history of Krispy Kreme, too. So be sure to tune in to the next episode. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you have an awesome week filled with laughs, good food, and many interesting things learned. If you would like to reach out to me, the way to do that is to leave a comment, or if you're listening on the radio, you can email me at contactdownhomeshow@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, be blessed.